has come to the rescue of Palestine by enforcing this Red Sea blockade, which has hit Israel with the biggest economic and military blow in the region.
Sounds like Yemen could really use some democracy. We need to reform those people. We need to export our Western values to Yemen. Let's free Yemen from the Yemenis. They've had it for too long. They squandered it. Look at their backwards civilization.
More program of the CIA arming the Syrian rebels. David Petraeus at the time actually said that it was Benjamin Netanyahu himself that was pressuring the United States to keep sending weapons into Syria. And so we have a situation where the whole entirety of those protests were hijacked and turned into a movement to overthrow the government. There is no question about that. If we see the media right now with our bare eyes, and we are witness to how the media, whether it's in the United States or in the UK, blatantly lie and produce mass atrocity propaganda about what is happening in Gaza, in Palestine, in Israel, to manufacture consent for the war there. Can you imagine how much they produced to promote a sectarian civil war in Syria to drive mass public support for the United States to pump that country with weapons to create that civil war? That's what happened. And I saw Muslims en masse fall for that sectarian narrative. I saw people use the whole anti-Assad, pro-Assad labeling. In reality, it wasn't about supporting Assad or being against him. It was simply just pointing out the fact that the United States was pumping millions of weapons into this country to make Syria into a failed state the same way it did to Libya by overthrowing the Libyan government of Muammar Gaddafi.
Initially, it was Syrians who rose up, and it's hundreds and thousands of Syrians that have paid the price for this. It wasn't the rebel groups that were bombing and barrel bombing and decimating entire towns and cities. That was Russia, and that was Assad, and that's what they posit back to you. What would you say to that?
I'm not here to defend Assad or what he did, because there's no question that the Assad government and military did respond with a heavy hand. But I'm not sure what they were supposed to do when it was fully aware and open that the United States was, arming this insurgency. We have to ask ourselves, why was Israel treating a lot of these fighters in their field hospitals? Why has Israel bombed Syria over 1,000 times since the onslaught of this crisis? So I think people who are looking at it only from one perspective and not the bigger perspective of the region of why Syria was targeted, I think that is very immature of them, because they are falling for this Western agenda of overthrowing and toppling the Assad government. And, Saddam Hussein was no angel himself, right? Mm-hmm. But guess what? The United States toppled that government. They killed over 1 million people in that country. And so I'm only looking at it from the role of my government, the United States, and their military and what they did there. But the truth is...
She's pointing out, what is essentially happening is that she's pointing out the principal contradiction, and he's pointing out a secondary contradiction, the internal domestic politics within the country. And she's talking about imperialism versus anti-imperialism, political sabotage, foreign, coups on their government from outside foreign entities, as opposed to internal civil war. She's really, I've been enjoying her answers. I've been enjoying this conversation, whoever shared this, thank you. Manar Adley, I haven't heard of her, and I guess maybe I should follow this. Y'all give me some good channels to follow, so I appreciate that. Let's see what else she says.
Syria has always been a target of the U.S. I mean, in every single military report, Syria has been a target, along with Libya and Iran and Lebanon, because of Hezbollah, of course. And the reason is because Syria acts as a pipeline for weapons to the resistance. I mean, there's no question about that. Now, if you're going to ask me, is Bashar al-Assad, great or whatever, I think that's an irrelevant question. I don't support Bashar al-Assad. He's not my president. I'm not Syrian to speak on that. But I do know that from speaking to many Syrians is that the United States now has effectively sanctioned Syria under the Caesar Act, which is completely devastating Syria's ability to rebuild the country. And then we have to ask ourselves too, why is the United States occupying 1/3 of Syrian land right now?
Right, that's another thing I was hoping she was gonna bring up. Victoria Nuland admitted this as well. She was instrumental in the Ukrainian coup in 2014. The United States military owns 1/3 of all Syrian territory. It's owned literally by the United States.
Gas is, and all the resources is. This was never about revolution. This was never about freedom. Okay, this started with Obama and Samantha Power's humanitarian intervention propaganda to say, let's go bomb people to save people. Let's go arm these people to save people. It wasn't just Assad killed his own people. And these rebels weren't just fighting with homemade weapons. They were being armed by the most powerful country in the world, which is the United States.
Just kind of finishing up on Syria. I mean, look.
It's like every time you hear, the State Department talk about some other leader's atrocities, you have to wonder, what is the actual story? What are the facts that are omitted? We in the West were made to believe, oh, well, Assad's just this genocidal psychopath who is gassing his own people or whatever. You got to paint your enemies as like this caricature, cartoonishly evil, to justify what has become axiomatic with U.S. foreign policy, that we should be meddling in the Middle East. We should be arming militant groups in Syria. We should be controlling the oil and all the Middle East resources.
What you presented there, it will upset a lot of Syrians. It will upset a lot of non-Syrians, a lot of Sunni Muslims, who's from a particular lens, from a particular prism. And that was the wider context of the Arab Spring, right, where we saw tyrants falling. Ben Ali, Ali Abdullah Saleh, Mubarak, Gaddafi via NATO. There were hopes and aspirations for Bashar to fall. There were uprisings in Bahrain, which was violently quelled. And it was kind of within this kind of framing of a kind of revivalist hopes in the Sunni Arab world, where these tyrants or these regimes were falling and they were hopefully going to be replaced by something better, whether it was Islamic or not, or something better than what it was. And of course, Syria took a very strong sectarian turn very quickly. Have you never felt conflicted about that? As a journalist, as an editor of a media outlet, as a Palestinian, have you ever felt conflicted about how you reported or saw the Syrian issue?
No, I didn't, because I read the RAND reports and I read the think tank reports that stated specifically that they would use sectarianism to draw Sunni support for this war. And I saw it within my own family, was majority Sunni, who also said, oh my gosh, this is, Sunnis killing, or Shias killing Sunnis, and we have to go, and this, I've heard it all because it happened within my own family. But those are just emotional reactions and responses. Where were all those people when the people of Bahrain were protesting against their government and there was a complete media blackout against their protest movement? They were in Arab Spring as well, but because they were Shia, we saw the majority of Sunnis not even mention Bahrain. Where were our Sunni brothers and sisters when the people of Yemen were being bombed for over a decade and being succumbed to a blockade that left 23 million people today that are still starving? Where have we been? As a community, as an ummah, as Muslims, I refuse to play the Sunni Shia card because it is more important to me for us to unite as Muslims under the banner of breaking the chains of Western colonialism.
There you go. She's right on the money with the principal aspect in this geopolitical situation, which is imperialism, colonialism versus anti-imperialism, anti-colonialism. And, his point was to bring up the soldiers that actually did fight against Assad and they believed that they were doing something good, like did they die in vain? There's a really good book which you may or may not like, but it's by Vincent Bevins, who wrote The Jakarta Method, and he wrote a new book called If We Burn, and it deals with this law of unintended consequences in revolutionary times, how they're very uncertain, and how these movements often begin with genuine outrage, genuine appeals to democratic ideals and morality and what's right, but they can be subverted and they can be sabotaged, and that's what the CIA is literally meant to do. They're a destabilizing organization around the world. The CIA is the largest terrorist organization in the entire world, and the United States is the #1 terror state without question, and it is consistently ranked by the international community in census polls to be the greatest threat to world peace. So none of this can be overstated. But If We Burn is the name of the book by Vincent Bevins, which goes through a lot of the similar historical period that she's talking about, the Arab Spring. There's a couple things that are common features, I think, about revolutionary times, and this is coming from Vincent Bevins now that I'm remembering, but they often cluster around each other. Sort of makes you think about the domino effect, the domino theory that Henry Kissinger was so afraid of, that any sort of revolution, working class revolution, socialist revolution that took hold in a country, no matter how small that country or inconsequential that country might be, it was very important to stomp that out because it would incite other countries to follow suit, and that's largely true, as I understand it. And I think the Arab Spring would be an instance of that, where, events in Turkey influenced events in Egypt, which influenced events, in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. But they all kind of played out differently, and yeah, we're just talking about how things can be subverted. And she's correct to point out that the CIA, that's the principal contradiction here, and that should take precedent, and we have to educate people. The most pressing pressing issue in these sorts of situations is nationalism versus imperialism, indigenous nationalism versus imperialism. And putting aside, in times of peace, in other words, the principal contradiction would be, Assad versus his people, the ruling class versus the working class, rich versus poor within that national territory. But because that national territory is being sabotaged and invaded, that is the time when class differences get put aside and they take on the more pressing issue, which is to repel imperialism. Let's keep going.
And that's really where true liberation in the region will come. What version of Islam are these fighters even fighting for and pushing for? What kind of Islamic state were they trying to establish? Because the United States would only allow for an ISIS-like Islamic state, because look at who they have always funded and armed and provided the means to have power in the region. Look at what they did in Afghanistan. Look at what they've done in African countries and across, places in the Middle East. It is a Western-pushed version of Islam, which, by the way, is only going to fuel stereotypes about Muslims through this Islamophobic tropes that exist within our media. That's the version, that's the kind of Islamic state that the United States would allow to exist in Syria if it were to allow.
Same thing that Israel does to Palestine, specifically to Gaza, destabilize it, foment radical extremism, end quote. I say end quote because the real radical extremists are Israel and the United States. And when you pursue a policy of indiscriminate violence, you can be sure that will foment and cultivate quote-unquote radical extremism. Extremists groups that have armed resistance. It's really not that extreme under those extreme conditions. It's only the normal, right, correct thing to do. But that is a necessity if you want to normalize what should not be normalized, which is killing civilians en masse. But in order to do so, you need to have it look as if the land that you are occupying is so savage and barbaric. Look at these people. That's what Israel did in bringing about the rise of Hamas. Netanyahu funded Hamas directly through Qatar. He funneled money to Hamas to make sure that they stood antagonistically against the PLO, which was the previous organization that they wanted to paint as destable and barbaric and savage and couldn't be negotiated with. Because if you can paint your enemies to look like that, it's much more easy to gain sympathy in the eyes of the international community. If you say, look at these savages I'm dealing with. But what's missing from a lot of this analysis is that the Israeli state in this instance is the sole engineer for that geopolitical